Good evening and welcome to episode 98 of Mystery, Murder, and Mayhem. I hope y'all have had a good week since the last time we hung out. And this weather is nutty. I don't know how it is where you are, but y'all, it was starting to feel like spring and certainly looking like spring because the pollen has been all over the place. Anywhere it could land, including my car. That poor car is silver, but it's been mostly a yellowish green color. And then adding to that is cat paw prints going from the front to the back of it. But then all of a sudden we're back in that cold snap. We've even had some freeze warnings. We actually have one for tonight. But they say it's supposed to start warming up this weekend or this week. And I saw a funny meme on Facebook a while ago. It was talking about how here in the South, Mother Nature is gonna cook us or bake us this summer because the pollen was the seasoning, and then she threw us back in the refrigerator to marinate. I probably didn't tell it as funny as it was, but you get the gist. But anyway, y'all. So tonight I'm going to be telling you the story about the murder of two young girls here in South Carolina. And it took place back in 1985. Now I can remember most of the details like it was yesterday because at the time I was 13. And where it took place was only about 45 miles from here where I live. And all of our parents were just in this big panic to protect us. And I can remember not being able to go anywhere or do anything while all this was going on. It was summertime, or right at the beginning of summertime when school was getting out. And, we couldn't go anywhere or do anything without an adult chaperoning us. So it was just a total bummer for us. Of course, we didn't understand our parents' feelings at the time because we were still young. And thought, oh, they're just being overprotective or whatever. But we were young and carefree. But now that, I'm a parent, I totally get it because, I wouldn't want the same thing happening to my kids. But I honestly, too, believe that that's when our carefree days ended. Like, before that, I can remember, we would play all over the neighborhood and not have to check in. And we didn't have cell phones. So our parents honestly really, they had an idea where we were, but it wasn't like they knew exactly where we were at. We were out riding bikes and all that. But anyway, there's a lot to this story that I'm telling y'all tonight, so stick around. Shari Faye Smith was a young, beautiful 17-year-old girl in the spring of 1985. On May 31st, she was looking forward to singing the national anthem at her high school graduation, and on that particular day, she was just getting home from a graduation pool party when the unthinkable happened. When she got to the family's driveway, she stepped out of her car to check the mail, and just in the blink of an eye, she vanished. Right there in broad daylight with her family, including her dad, was just yards away. Can you imagine your kid is at the end of the driveway? She just disappears. And all that was left behind was the mail she had stopped to get from the mailbox and her car that was still running. Shari's dad, Bob, worked from home, and his office was on the second floor of the Smith's home. When he saw Shari pull into the driveway, he noticed that she had gone to get the mail, and then he went back to doing what he was working on. And when he looked up again just a few minutes later, maybe not even that long, he noticed that the car was still there, but he didn't see Shari. So he stopped what he was doing and ran down the driveway to check on her. Like I said, her car was still sitting there, and it was running with the keys in the ignition. Even her purse was in the car, but there was absolutely no sign at all of young Shari. Bob ran back up the driveway, and he immediately called the Lexington County Sheriff's Office. And at that time, the sheriff in Lexington County was James Metz. And he just happened to be a friend of the Smith family. And once he heard about the call from Bob, he drove to the Smith's house. And once he got there, he saw Shari's blue Chevrolet Chevette sitting at the end of the driveway and her distressed parents anxiously waiting by the door. And since Sheriff Metz had known Shari her entire life and knew that she was a good kid, he knew that something had to be very wrong, because there was no way that Shari would have just taken off on her own like that. And at that point, it was all hands on deck with the sheriff's department, and they immediately started combing the area looking for any little inkling of a clue that could help them figure out just what had happened to her. They drove up and down all the country roads that was surrounding the Smith home, and on one of those roads, they found a red bandana that was laying out in plain sight, like out in the middle of the road. And it just happened to be the red bandana that Bob had seen Shari wearing when he saw her at the end of their driveway. And this led investigators to believe that Shari had been kidnapped. But that's really all they had to go on at that point. And that's Ariel snoring in the background, if you can hear that. Well, the hours following her disappearance ticked away, and there were no more clues found. There was no leads. There was nothing. And just imagine the mental anguish that her family had to be going through. They didn't know if Shari was okay or not, or if she was scared, or if she was even alive at that point. Well, the following morning, 300 volunteers met up in that area to do a foot search for Shari. And there was, aircraft searching from up in the skies over Lexington. But even after hours of searching, there was still nothing. Well, night turned to day, and that's when the first of several phone calls would start. At 3 a.m, the house phone rang, and Shari's mom, Hilda, was the one who answered. Now, she was thinking at first that it was somebody from the sheriff's office, but it didn't take her long to realize that it was actually her daughter's kidnapper that she was speaking to. The man on the other end of the line said that her daughter was still alive, and he requested that the sheriff's department's search be called off. It was probably more of a demand than a request. I'm pretty sure of that. Now, he also described the clothes that Shari was wearing and told Hilda that in the coming days that she would receive proof in the mail that Shari was still alive. And he also said that he would be calling again. And that was the end of that phone call. Well, at that point, Shari had been missing for 3 days. And after she hung up with that caller, she immediately informed the deputies of the phone call just as soon as they had disconnected. Well, from there, the investigators rushed to the phone company to pull records of incoming calls to the Smith's phone. And from that, they were able to determine that the phone call had been placed from a payphone outside of a local store called Taylor's Grocery. And that little grocery store was only 12 miles from the Smith's house. But nobody at the grocery store remembered seeing anyone around the phone booth. And because the caller had said that they would receive a letter from Shari soon, investigators went from there to the post office, and they requested that they open the office so they could sift through all the tons of mail coming into Lexington, hoping that they could, go ahead and get that letter. Well, after searching, which I'm sure took lots of time, they searched through piles of envelopes, and they finally found the one they were looking for. The note inside that envelope wasn't exactly what they were looking for or what they were expecting. The note was written on 2 pieces of legal paper, but there wasn't a ransom or anything that you would normally find in a letter of this type. But its contents, they were disturbing enough. The title at the top of those papers read Last Will and Testament, and it was written in Shari's handwriting. And in the letter, she talked about how much she loved her family and her boyfriend. And she also talked about knowing that she would be going to heaven, and she told her family not to worry about her. Well, as you can imagine, the tone of that letter from Shari was terribly, terribly upsetting for her loved ones to read. I mean, can you just imagine getting a letter in the mail that your 17-year-old daughter that is missing had written, and at the top it says Last Will and Testament, and she's talking about don't worry about her. She knows she's going to go to heaven. I mean, and that really is saying, hey, I know that I'm about to die. Well, knowing that this was written as a goodbye to her loved ones, investigators really began picking up their efforts even more to find Shari before it was too late. Now, like I said earlier, the caller that Shari's mom had talked to said that he would call again. So this time, the sheriff's department wanted to be ready to trace that call. So they set that up between the Smith's phone and the phone company. Tracing calls takes a little bit of effort. And in order to see where that call was being placed, the caller would have to be kept on the phone for at least a minute. And that would more than likely be a major act itself, because most people who commit these types of crimes know this, and they like to keep their phone calls short and sweet. So they had to make a plan. And it was decided that Hilda would be the one to speak to the caller. And true to his word, it wouldn't be long before the kidnapper would call again. And Hilda answered the phone. Now, can you imagine the burden that had to be? And you know that your child's fate rested on you. And you have to keep that caller on the phone for at least a minute. And yeah, a minute doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but when you're under that stress, the seconds probably tick by at the pace of a turtle. But Hilda, she was able to keep him talking with her soft, calm voice. In their conversation, they talked about the letter that they had received from Shari. And Hilda also told him that she really didn't believe that Shari was still alive or well, because she hadn't spoke to Shari, meaning that she needed to hear it from Shari, not just read those words. The caller said that she would know in 2 or 3 days if Shari was okay, to which Hilda asked why. The caller ended the call by saying, quote, call the search off. Well, despite her best efforts, the phone call hadn't lasted long enough to trace it. And like I said, I'm sure he knew that he shouldn't be on the phone very long, so maybe he had rehearsed what he was going to say so he could quickly get it done. The following day, Shari's family appeared on the local news pleading for information and the safe return of their daughter. And I can remember watching that, and even though I was only 13 years old, the emotion that was like radiating from them was so powerful, and it just instantly made me sad, and I was so sorry that this had happened to them. Just mere hours after that heartfelt plea on TV, the Smiths received their third phone call from Shari's abductor. During that phone call, Hilda told the caller that there was no way she could ever be happy again if Shari wasn't in it. And I honestly believe that was her way, like as a mom, of appealing to him. Like trying to reach to his heart, maybe soften it a little. He told the family that even though the tone of the letter that he had sent to them was sad, Shari was still alive. And before disconnecting the call, he told them that he would call back again soon and give them the location of where they could find her. And just like before, he disconnected the call before it could be traced. But miraculously, somehow the investigators determined that the call had come from another phone booth that was close by. And when the abductor called back for the 4th time, he added more torment to their anxiety by delaying telling them Shari's location, by telling them that they'd have to wait one more day to see her. Hilda begged and pleaded with the caller to not kill her. And he replied with, quote, we love and miss y'all. Good night. End quote. But the entire time, Hilda was like begging him to keep him talking to her. but he disconnected that call again. So the Smith spent another night agonizing and praying for Shari's safety and her safe return. Well, at this point, it had been nearly a week since Shari's family had seen her. A week without knowing if she was okay or not, and a week without knowing if they would ever even see her again. It was a week of torment from her abductor through short phone calls promising that she would be returned to them. Can you imagine the turmoil of going through all of that, not knowing if the person on the other end of the phone was being honest, and not knowing if he was really just playing with your emotions? Now, as a mom myself, I can't even imagine what her family was going through. Well, finally, on the following day at 11:54 a.m., that next call came in. And Hilda talked to him again this time, and the caller told her exactly where she could find her daughter, and he even gave her directions. And he told Hilda to take Highway 378 west and then take the Prosperity exit. And from there, she would go a mile or a mile and a half and turn right at where there was a Moose Lodge sign, then take a left after a quarter mile, and they would find them, as in Shari and the abductor. And they would be in a backyard behind a home. And then again, he disconnected the call. So see, he gave her very specific directions to where to find them. Well, investigators raced to where the caller had said that they would be found while Shari's family waited at home. And I know they probably wanted to go, but it was probably something that, I guess maybe the investigators maybe wanted to make sure that he wasn't playing with them once again. Well, they believed that Shari would be found alive and this entire ordeal would be over. And Sheriff Metz, he was actually the first one to reach the location that the kidnapper had given directions to. But what he found, it wasn't what he had hoped for. It wasn't what anybody had hoped for. Because what he found was Shari's body lying face up on the ground, still wearing the same clothes that she had had on when she disappeared. And she had been covered with a plastic, like this clear plastic covering. And that poor 17-year-old that nearly the entire state of South Carolina had hoped and prayed for a safe return to her family was deceased. But back at the Smith residence, the family, they were waiting anxiously for the investigators to return. They were hoping that their daughter and their sister, Shari had a younger brother and an older sister, but they were all hoping that she would soon be back with them. But once investigators returned, they knew from the way that the officers was approaching their home that they wouldn't receive the news that they had hoped for. And I'm sure all along they had known that it was possible that Shari wouldn't be coming back home to them. But, to hear the words spoken out loud had to be beyond devastating. While the Smiths were processing their emotions, investigators were combing the scene of where her body had been found for any evidence that the abductor, now murderer, had left behind. But there was not one shred of evidence left for the investigators to go on. The only thing that they knew on that day was that it appeared that Shari's body had been at that location for several days. Well, come to find out, the abductor had actually killed Shari the day he snatched her from the mailbox. And he had been playing with the Smith's emotions for all those following days. Just because Shari's body had been found didn't mean that the killer was finished playing with them. At that point, Hilda just couldn't face talking to him or really anybody anymore on the phone. So investigators convinced Shari's older sister, Dawn, she had came home from college when Shari went missing. But they, talked her into talking to the abductor / killer. Well, when he called back, he told Dawn that he had given her a choice of either being shot, given a drug overdose, or being suffocated. And he told Dawn that her sister had chosen to die by suffocation. And then Dawn asked him why he had to kill her, and he responded with, quote, "It got out of hand. I got scared because only God knows, Dawn. I don't know why. God forgive me for this, but I'm not going to be in prison." End quote. And I can remember watching a show on ID about this case and seeing Dawn talking about him, all of this going on. And I was just thinking that, Dawn had to be awfully brave to talk to the man who had just killed her sister. I mean, Dawn herself wasn't much older than Shari, because Dawn was 21 years old when this happened. So just think about what that must be like to have to go through mentally as a young adult. And I don't think I could have kept my composure the way Dawn did. Well, Sheriff Metz didn't keep his composure either, and he grabbed the phone out of Dawn's hand, and he told the caller that they were going to get him. And you can't blame him. This was a case they had been working on from nearly the moment that Shari had disappeared. They had all hoped that she would be found alive. And Sheriff Metz, he had kids of his own, and I'm sure he was thinking that this could have just as easily have happened to one of his children. I mean, a lot of parents were thinking that this could have happened to, any of their children. Well, this time they were able to trace the phone call, and it was traced to a truck stop 60 miles away. But of course, by the time they got there, the phone booth was empty. And at this point, they called in the FBI for help, and they were able to develop a profile of the killer. Now, the profile said that the person would be in their late 20s to early 30s. They would live alone or maybe with their parents. And they would be somebody that no one would believe would be capable of committing such a crime. The profiler also gave them some advice by saying that they believed that the killer would continue to call the family, and that Shari's sister Dawn would be the best person to keep him engaged so that he would be called. Now, imagine the weight of that burden placed on you at 21 years old. And I'm sure each phone call became harder for her. And then suddenly, those phone calls just stopped. And weeks passed without a call from the killer. What did the silence mean? I mean, had he disappeared, or had he moved on to his next victim? Well, 2 weeks after Shari had been abducted, 911 operators in neighboring Columbia, South Carolina, received a frantic phone call. A 9-year-old girl had been kidnapped again, and this happened in broad daylight. Debra Mae Helmick and her younger brother, they had been playing outside in the family's front yard when a man walked up to them. Well, this time a neighbor was watching from his window. Now, at first, the neighbor thought that maybe the man knew the 2 kids, but just moments later, he knew that wasn't the case at all, because he saw the man grab Debra. He grabbed her from behind, and she was kicking and screaming, trying to get away from him. Well, the man helplessly watched as the man sped away with little Debra in his vehicle. And that neighbor ran to Helmick's home and told Debra's father what he had just seen, and gave him a description of the car. And that's when 911 call was placed. Now, I know there's going to be questions about why didn't the man try to stop it. That I don't know. At first I thought maybe he was like disabled or, something like that. But he did run to their home and tell Debra's father. So I really don't know what stopped him from trying to stop the man. But anyway, the neighbor, he was able to give the police a description of the kidnapper. And from that, they were able to develop a composite drawing, but that lead went nowhere. Now, in the beginning of Debra's case, investigators didn't believe that her case was related to Shari's because of their age difference. Because, like I said, Shari was 17 and Debra Mae was 9. Well, and because of the 2 different cities, because, like I said, Shari was in Lexington and Debra was over in Columbia, 2 different counties, but they're really not all that far apart. But, then investigators from both sheriff's offices got together and started comparing notes, and soon they realized that the cases had to be related. And this news was really hard for the Helmick family to take, because they knew that Shari's kidnapping had ended in her death. But, that didn't stop them from hoping and praying for a different outcome for their little girl, Debra. Well, 8 days would pass after Debra's kidnapping before another phone call was made. But it wasn't made to the Helmick family like you would think. It was actually a phone call that Dawn Smith received. And the caller asked Dawn if she had heard about Debra Mae Helmick. And then he went on to tell Dawn where police could find the little girl, again giving these very precise directions. Well, Sheriff Mance followed those directions, and he soon located Debra's body. And like Shari's, her body had been there for days. And let's just talk about Sheriff Mance for a minute, because, he was the one that had discovered Shari's body. And then he was the one to just, to find Debra's body. And like I said, he had kids too. I just can't even imagine what that had to be like, being the one to find two girls, and especially in that close time frame, finding them deceased. But anyway, at that point, authorities knew that if they didn't locate the killer soon, there would be a third victim. And then finally, investigators at this point got the big break that they needed. And that break, it came from the 2 sheets of paper that Shari Smith had written her last will and testament on. After processing it through, they've got this special equipment that detects clues that's not seen by the naked eye. And from that, they were able to find a name and a part of a phone number. And that phone number led them to a couple named Ellis and Sharon Shepard. They lived only a few miles from the Smiths. And investigators went there and they questioned the Shepards about any possible involvement that they might have in the 2 kidnappings. But the Shepards had actually been away for over a month, like on vacation. And that was during the time that the kidnappings had taken place. And their alibi did check out, and they were cleared of any suspicion in the cases. Well, before they left the sheriff's office, the investigators asked the Shepards to listen to a recording of one of the phone calls in hopes that the man's voice could be identified, like maybe it would sound familiar to him. Well, Mr. Shepard knew right away who the caller was, and he named that person as Larry Gene Bell. And after seeing the composite sketch of the suspect, the Shepards knew that it had to be Bell. Well, the Shepards then told the investigators that while they had been on vacation, Bell had been staying in their home as a house sitter, and once they were back home, they noticed that Bell had an unusual obsession with these kidnappings. He would talk nonstop about the case, and he had even kept clippings from newspaper articles talking about them. And when investigators checked Bell's criminal history, they knew without a doubt that he was the one they had been looking for. Now, in the past, Bell had had convictions for stalking females and making obscene phone calls to women. And from one of his arrests, he had been referred to a psychiatrist for counseling for these behaviors. So he definitely fit the part, and he became suspect number 1 for investigators. But then they had to find him and hopefully do that before he struck again. And that wouldn't be hard, though. With an arrest warrant in hand, tons of cops surrounded his home, and soon he was in handcuffs and on his way to the sheriff's office. When they took Bell into the interrogation room, he was greeted by photos of Shari Smith and Debra Mae Helmick that had been placed around the room. And investigators had done this to try and subtly urge him to confess. Now, he was visibly disturbed by this, but despite it, he denied having anything to do with Shari's or Debra's murders. He denied even knowing anything about them other than what he had seen on the news. And he had been in custody for nearly 12 hours when he made a request that shocked everyone in the room with him. He asked to meet with Hilda and Dawn Smith. Now, investigators, they were blown away by that request and weren't even sure if either of the Smith women would agree to it. but they did agree to it in hopes of getting a confession from him. Shari's mom, Hilda, told Belle that she knew that it was him and that he had killed her daughter, and also told him that she didn't hate him. Now, I'm not so sure if I had been in that position, I would have had as much grace as Miss Smith did. But even after that, Belle refused to confess to kidnapping and murdering Shari. And it turns out that investigators wouldn't need a confession after all, because what they uncovered when they executed search warrants was pretty damning. Shari's body and her hair, or blood in her hair, was found on Belle's shoes. And even more damning than that was the indentations that had been left behind from that name and partial phone number that had been found on Shari's last will and testament letter to her family. At that point, Belle was formally charged with Shari's kidnapping and murder. When this case went to trial, and this was just for Shari's case, Belle tried to get off on an insanity plea. And in court, he would say really odd stuff. And he even took the stand in his own defense. And you might remember when I was covering the Murdaugh murder trials, I talked about how unheard of it is for suspects to take the stand in their own trials. And get this, y'all, while Belle was on the stand, he asked Dawn Smith to marry him. I mean, what the hell? Well, fortunately, the jury didn't buy anything that Belle was trying to sell him, and it only took him an hour to find Larry Jean Belle guilty of kidnapping and murdering Shari Faye Smith. Now, following that trial, Belle stood trial for the kidnapping and murder of Debra May Helmick, where he was once again found guilty, and he received the death sentence, or the death penalty, for both of these cases. He was executed on October the 4th, 1996. Now, y'all, I have said it before, and I know I'll say it again. You know, we think we're safe here in our little southern state, but cases like this and others, they just show that you're not really safe anywhere. It's a sad but true fact, you know. Anything can happen in the blink of an eye. Well, y'all, that's all I have for tonight's episode. Y'all have a great rest of your week, and be sure to come back next week for another all-new mystery, murder, and mayhem.